So you want to be a soulless vampiric sea elf? Who doesn't? Welcome to Wargames on Toast, and in this video I am going to teach you how to play the Idoneth Deepkin. Or try to. Idoneth. Man, Idoneth do be having some problems. Before we dive into the meat of things, let's quickly touch on what makes Idoneth, well, Idoneth with some pros and some cons, starting with the pros. And firstly, we have their theme. Very few warbands pack as much theme into their abilities and their units as Idoneth does. Secondly, their speed. Even for elves, Idoneth are incredibly fast on their feet, especially early in the game and even more so on turn 1. Then we have power. Idoneth are surprisingly strong for elves, as in their strength stat, not their actual competitive viability. Most of your guys are rocking strength 4 at base and can increase that even further with their battle trait and abilities. Then we have support and utility. Idoneth have a lot of quality support in their kit with nets, pulls, negations, and even some gain-winning debilitations. And then finally, their Bladeborn. Their Bladeborn at worst are interesting and at best are outstanding. Sadly, Idoneth also have a fair few cons, first of which are that these guys are expensive. Just about everything in Idoneth is a little bit overpriced. They are also squishy. Just about everything in Idoneth is made of paper and cannot take a hit. And then we have theme part 2. Their theme is great, but this doesn't always translate into good mechanics or easy to use mechanics on the tabletop. And finally, unlike other compendium factions like, say, Seraphon, the Idoneths don't have that many options to choose from, and many of those options are not great, making them quite difficult to play and list build. With all of that in mind and out of the way, let's move on to their abilities, their traits, and their units, starting with their battle trait, the Power of the Tides. Power of the Tides is often overlooked on the power scale for battle traits because Idoneth are not commonly run. However, Power of the Tides is one of the best battle traits in the game because it offers a disgusting amount of value for free with no real downside. It comes in 2 parts, with the active part depending on what turn it is. On turn 1 and turn 2, your warband gains +1 movement universally, and on turn 3 and turn 4, your entire warband gains +1 strength in melee. If that doesn't sound all that great, let's break that down in a slightly different way to really highlight how good this actually is. On turn 1 and turn 2, your entire warband functionally gains Rush, a resource, for free, and can combine that buff with other movement granting abilities like Rush. The fact that this lasts for 2 whole turns is outstanding and lets the already fast Idoneth, these guys are movement 5 at base, okay, the already fast Idoneth dance around the battlefield effortlessly, especially on turn 1 when you factor in low tide, which I will get to later on. Then on turn 3 and turn 4, you gain +1 strength on everything. Now sadly, this does only apply to melee attacks, but your whole warband wounding things easier in later turns is not to be scoffed at. Suddenly your already high strength chaff are smashing through toughness easier, and this combines with other abilities like Way of the Depths and High Tide. 2 abilities I will cover later on. Overall, their battle trait is great, and I even tend to build my lists around it. I like to dance around turn 1 and turn 2, keeping away and pressuring with range attacks before diving in on turn 3 and really pushing that strength advantage. Of course, depending on what you are up against, this might not work all that well, so you will have to adapt. Such is the nature of Warcry. Moving on to their reaction, we have Fade from Memory, and this is one of the weirdest yet potentially most impactful reactions in Warcry. It's also really situational and requires a lot of setup to get the most out of. Fade from Memory reads, a fighter can make this reaction when an enemy fighter finishes a move action within 3 inches of them. If there is another friendly fighter visible to that enemy fighter and within range of at least one of that enemy fighter's melee weapons, For the rest of the battle round, that enemy fighter cannot target this fighter. Fade from memory is potentially the perfect defensive tool. It is one of the only ways you can flat out deny an opponent from attacking something you don't want attacked, and this can have massive ramifications if you prepare for it. Keeping your important pieces or your near-death pieces in close proximity to your other units makes it much harder for your opponent to kill your guys, at least on the turn that they move into combat. Importantly, they have to make a move action to trigger it. If they are already in combat, well, you are boned. Now, it can be tricky to get this setup just right, as most things have a 1-inch range, and if you aren't positioned correctly, they might be able to get into a place where you can't react. However, that gets much harder to accomplish for your opponent if they have range 2 or range 3 weapons. In fact, these weapons become incredibly clunky for your opponent to use, especially if the thing that has these weapons has a big base. As a recent example, a Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, a big range 2 guy on a big old base, tried to kill a low wound elf. Due to terrain and positioning, there was no way for this Shaggoth to one, stay on the objective and attack and kill the elf he needed to kill to win the game, and not be in range of another much tougher elf. I popped the reaction, the almost guaranteed kill became literally impossible, and I was able to win the game from there. It's not something you will aim to pop off every turn or even every game, but like with all situational reactions, keep this in the back of your mind. It's also really important to remember the last little bit of this reaction. For the rest of the battle round, that enemy fighter cannot target this fighter. This is important because even if the thing that prevents them from attacking you dies, they cannot attack the model that reacted. Not only that, they can't even be given extra attack actions from external sources that battle round to attack you to avoid it, because the effect lasts the entire battle round, not just their activation. Finally, in the rare instances where a unit has a range attack with a 0-inch minimum and a melee attack and they trigger this reaction, even though the effect can only trigger based on their melee range, they are still not able to cheese you and use their range attack to get around it because they cannot target you at all. That section of the rule is not melee weapon based, it's a flat effect that prevents targeting by anything. Very powerful, very tricky, very situational. Before we move on to their units, I am going to quickly touch on their more generic abilities. These are abilities that every model in the warband has access to, and then I will go over specific abilities as and when they come up during the unit section. Idoneth Deepkin only have one, and that ability is Low Tide. A fighter can use this ability only if it is the first battle round. This fighter can make a bonus move action up to a number of inches equal to the value of this ability. This ability, despite only being usable on turn 1, is exceptional with Idoneth. This allows you to reposition your warband with ease. Combined with power of the tides, your models can move fast at base and then pop an additional burst of speed with Low Tide. This has all kinds of uses, for example, moving your models in range of an enemy to shoot them, or to move a fast moving model into combat early and still being able to attack, or even grabbing a treasure and making a quick getaway, since the movement reduction on carrying treasure does not slow you down when using Low Tide. Even just redeploying units on turn 1 faster to get out of bad deployment situations is fantastic. With your high movement and a strong Low Tide, your models can go up to 18 inches in a single turn if they are on foot, and even faster if they are not. I often try to use Low Tide as much as possible on turn 1 to maximize my warband's mobility and to set up for later turns. I also try to include a lot of ranged units in my lists, so getting them into position to fire even on turn 1 is great and is largely thanks to Low Tide. Now, the next ability isn't usable by everything. High Tide is only usable by hero models in Idoneth, but I think it's worth mentioning here because it's quite an important ability that works in a very unique way. It reads, a fighter can only use this ability if it is the third battle round. Add 1 to the attacks and strength characteristics of melee attack actions made by friendly fighters while they are within 6 inches of this fighter. Right off the bat, High Tide is incredibly restrictive. You can only use it on turn 3. You can't even use it on turn 4, so you have a very, very narrow window. This is the biggest downside of this ability by far. However, the effect is very strong. A 6-inch bubble for +1 attack, +1 strength is fantastic. Considering on turn 3 you are also getting +1 strength from Power of the Tides, you are looking at +1 attack, +2 strength in practice. With this in mind, even your most basic elves go to strength 6 and some even go as high as strength 7, which allows your guys to hit reliably. The extra attack means that they will hit harder too, as you are directly increasing your odds of rolling crits, and Idoneth have some pretty meaty crits in their lineup. Now, there is a slight elephant in the room with this ability, and that is the fact that this ability doesn't tell you when the effect ends. If you look at any other ability like this, Lead from the Back, Spurred by the Gods, or even fellow Idoneth ability, The Way of the Depths, they all say until the end of the battle round. High Tide does not. What does this mean? Well, it means that rules as written, once it is activated on round 3, it will remain active. Not only that, you can stack this. If you have multiple heroes, or even one hero waiting and popping it twice, you will gain the effect multiple times, and those effects will last all game once activated. Of course, the issue, like I said, with High Tide is that the window of activation is very narrow, and there is every chance you won't be able to use it because of the loss in tempo will be too high. On the plus side though, it also affects the hero using it, so your melee beaters can pop this, lose less tempo and gain all the benefits and start slaying. For example, things like the Soul Render go to a 5-6-2-5, which is a pretty darn impressive profile. Narrow window and potential loss in tempo aside, High Tide is a fantastic ability. I suspect now that I have said this in a video, it will get FAQ'd one way or another, so until then, clarify with your opponent, but rules as written it works this way and should be used this way. Plus, Idoneth Deepkin need all the help they can get. Potential High Tide drama out of the way, let's move on to units, and we start with the Achillean King with bladed polearm and or the Achillean King with greatsword. Of the two, I am a much bigger fan of the polearm. You lose an attack, but you gain a strength and you gain a range for the same price. This is well worth the trade-off because you are able to stay further back and poke at things who can't attack you without moving. This functionally halves their damage output and it forces them to potentially walk into a fade from memory trap. Stat-wise, you have movement 10 with fly, toughness 4 and a very respectable 35 wounds. Offensively, we are range 2, attacks 4, strength 5 with 2-5 damage. That 2-5 profile is a little bit piddly on a model this expensive, but it does enough to kill chaff and to kill mid-range, which is okay. If you want your Achillean King to be more killy into everything, you spend 30 points for a +1 damage blessing and then you are good to go. 4-5-3-5 is a very good profile. Of course, this brings the already expensive 305 point king to a whopping 335 points, making him one of the most expensive non-hero models in the entire game. All of that aside though, remember that the Achillean King has low tide, meaning that on turn 1 he can fly 10 inches, 11 inches with the trait, then low tide into combat and then attack. Theoretically, he can even low tide into combat and attack twice if something started on the board close enough. This early use of low tide on a model this fast is really good at shutting down low wound range units like Quiet Pock and Arbalistas, both of which are fairly common. His biggest claim to fame and the thing that makes him truly unique within Idoneth is his unique double, the Storm of Blows. Add half the value of this ability, rounding up to the attack's characteristic of the next melee attack action made by this fighter in this activation. Being able to pile a bunch of attacks into a single action is great any day of the week. If you use this whilst already in combat, you can focus down one lad and then free up your second attack for something else. If you are not in combat, you can fly 10 to 11 inches, pop Storm and then attack up to 7 times for a powerful charge, largely offsetting the fact that you just moved. Of course, Storm of Blows is dice dependent, but with a mid to high triple, it's very good and makes the king our best combat threat by far. Despite being more expensive than most other titans and dragons, I personally like to keep my Achillean King away from all of them as he is not up to the task of killing them for the most part. Instead, I like to use his fly and insane speed to get around and bully weak backlines and chaff, or just dropping him into a turn 2 deployment to bog them down. He is fantastic for that, even unblessed. Next up we have the Morsar and the Ishlian Guard Princes, and these are also fast moving, decently durable flying beaters, although at a hefty points reduction. These are 260 and 250 points respectively, and they both lose stomach blows from their kit, but they gain biovoltaic barrier and biovoltaic blast depending on which one you take. Starting with the Morsar, this guy is more expensive, but he gains an additional range and he gets biovoltaic blast, which is a quad. Basically, you deal dice value damage to all visible enemy fighters within 3 inches, and this is pretty good even if it is a quad. For its raw stats, the Morsar is comparable to many flyers in its price range, and the range too is really nice to have. In the right matchup and the right meta, that AoE and stat line will be very useful for blowing up hordes and just dealing flat damage. However, the Ishlian, in my opinion, is better overall. For 10 points less, you lose a range, but you keep everything else. 4425 in melee, movement 10, toughness 4, 25 wounds and fly. You also gain the biovoltaic barrier, which is a triple that downgrades all crits from all attacks, ranged, melee, it doesn't matter, to hits. This is potentially massive for survivability, as he can fly into a horde of chaff, pop this and he will never die. Even high crit chaff with crit 4 or crit 5 will bounce off an Ishlian guard, and you better believe he will grind through that chaff with that stat line. If I am taking either of the princes, I like to bless them with +1 strength to make them even better at blending, although +1 toughness or +4 wounds or even some damage will work as well. Of the two, I will nearly always take the Ishlian guard variant, and if I wanted something more aggressive, I would honestly just take an Achillean king instead. Onto the Ishran Soul Render, and this lad is sadly a little bit outclassed for his points, and we'll get into why when we touch onto Bladeborn a little bit later. However, for 185 points, you are getting movement 5, toughness 3, 22 wounds, a range 2 4425, and a range 3 3424 profile. This guy is really quite solid as an elf beta, especially once Battle Round 3 comes around. Going to strength 5 is really beneficial for him, and that range 2 and range 3 profile make him super versatile and safe when fighting enemies. Not only that, he also comes with one of the very few nets in the Order Grand Alliance, the Hangman's Knot. Pick a fighter within 3 inches, roll a dice, and on a 3+, they cannot make a move or disengage action. This is fantastic for dealing with titans, monsters, cavalry, or just stopping things from getting to objectives and the like. Nets are incredibly versatile, as is this lad. At 185 points, like I said, he is a little bit pricey, and you can get a similar model for cheaper elsewhere. However, if you don't want to use Bladeborn, then the Soul Render is great. The Kellyan Thrallmaster is up next, and this lad is a little bit of a whiffer. This is mostly because his defensive stats are not all that great. Movement 5, toughness 3, and 18 wounds for 170 points is very fragile. Offensively, 4425 at range 2 is pretty good, so he can do damage when he has to, but the main draw is his ability, the Way of the Depths, which increases the strength of melee attacks made by minions and agile rune-marked Idoneth by 1. Unfortunately, this ability is a triple, which is really expensive, and the tempo on it is awful since he himself does not benefit from the effect. In short, it's just too slow, the effect isn't really worth it, and frankly you might as well just wait until turn 3 for High Tide. Throw in some pretty mess stats and a fairly high cost and you can largely ignore this guy. Then we have the Ishran Soul Scryer, and despite being only 140 points, I am still not a fan. Despite looking like a wizard, the Soul Scryer is not. They only have a melee attack and it's not great. Range 2, 3424 with that all too familiar movement 5, toughness 3 and 18 wounds. It dies too quickly, its melee stat line gets it too close to danger, and that stat line isn't really good enough to warrant buying. They do have an ability though called Scryfish Shoal, which reads, pick a visible enemy fighter within 10 inches of this fighter and roll 6 dice. For each roll of a 4 to a 5, allocate 1 damage point to that fighter. For each roll of a 6, allocate 2 damage points to that fighter. And sadly, it's just not that great. It's too expensive, and the average damage of like 4 that you will do It's fine for doing chip damage, but it's a triple, right? It's a triple for like 4 damage. It's not good enough. It's too expensive. And then finally, we have the Ishran Tidecaster, who is our cheapest hero at 130 points. They have movement 5, toughness 3, and 18 wounds, as is to be expected at this point. Offensively, they rock range 2, 3-3-1-4, but more importantly, they have a range 3-7, 2-3-3-6 profile, immediately making this guy useful because wizard bolts are always nice to have. If you want a cheap hero, this chap fits the bill even without looking at his ability. Riptide. Riptide reads, pick a visible enemy fighter within 12 inches of this fighter until the end of the battle round. Subtract 1 from the attack's characteristic to a minimum of 1 of attack actions made by this fighter. Important to note that this ability does affect both melee and range attacks, and as a double, it's not all that bad, but the number of models that really care about -1 attack are fairly slim. If the effect was an AoE, or if the effect reduced attacks by more than 1, then this ability would actually be great. As it stands though, this is a bit forgettable and a bit underwhelming in equal measure. The character itself is fine, but you will likely look elsewhere for your heroes. Ishlian Guards, Kings, and Bladeborn offerings just do more for you, even if they are admittedly more expensive. Thanks for watching this far. If you like what you've seen, please consider hitting like, comment, and subscribing. You can also use my affiliate link on screen now to help the channel out when buying gubbins for your next project. I also have a Patreon which you can join for as little as £1, $1, or one of your regional currencies, and this helps me continue doing what I do. Thanks to all my patrons and members who are on screen now. Back to the show. And we are back and onto fighters, and we have the Morsar and the Ishlian Guard, just the non-prince variants. These have the same abilities as their hero counterparts, minus High Tide. Stat-wise, they are both movement 10, toughness 4 with 20 wounds, but offensively they are very, very different. The Morsar has a range 2, 3-4-2-4, and the Ishlian has a range 1, 4-3-2-4. And at base, neither are that great. Honestly, at 200 points for the Morsar and 100 for the Ishlian, they are kind of fine, but they do need a little bit of help. The Morsar really wants an attack blessing to make an impact, and the Ishlian wants strength. For me, once again, the Ishlian, due to being cheaper and easier to fix, is the one I would go for if I wanted to take one. Not to mention it also has Biovoltaic Barrier, which is better than Biovoltaic Blast in most cases, in my opinion, making me a fantastic budget tank if you can't afford the full-blown Prince variant. He's a solid choice if that is what you are looking for. Shockingly, we are nearing the end already with the Namarti Reaver, and sadly the Reaver is a little bit of a whiff. For 105 points, movement 6, toughness 3 and wound 8, with a 3-3-1-3 at 1 inch range and a 2-3-1-3 at a range 3 to 15. He's okay, movement 6 is really nice, range 15 is excellent, but the damage and the strength aren't that great, and the cost is just a bit too high, even when you factor in their ability, Stormfire, which is legitimately good. Stormfire is until the end of the fighter's activation, add 1 to the attack's characteristic of missile attack actions made by this fighter. It's just onslaught for range attacks. They go to a 3-3-1-3, which is a perfectly respectable range profile for just crit fishing and chipping things down from safety, and ideal in the early game when Idoneth is running around and just throwing things before they flip into murder mode. All that being said though, I really struggle to justify 105 points for what they bring, especially when defensively they are so fragile. Wounds 8 is nowhere near high enough for something this expensive. Finally, we move on to Namarti Thralls, and these are almost okay. Movement 5, toughness 3 and wound 8 for 80 points is a little bit high and a little bit fragile. However, range 2, 3-4-1-4 is not a bad melee profile. The range 2 in particular is very nice to have, as is the base strength 4, allowing them to fight with other chaff quite effectively, and not to mention that range 2 means you can hang back and poke things, and if things move in to engage you, well, you can now use Fade from Memory and lure them into that trap. But again, 80 points is so high, and it completely kneecaps Idoneth as a faction, as this is the cheapest thing they have access to, and it's so fragile. Not to mention their unique ability, Sweeping Blow, is straight up awful. You roll a dice for each visible enemy fighter within 2 inches. On a roll of a 5+, allocate 1 damage point to the fighter being rolled for, and on a roll of a 6, allocate a number of damage points to that fighter being rolled for equal to the value of this ability. Sure, you might land a killer AoE blow on a bunch of things by rolling a whole bunch of 6s and getting lucky. But come on, it's just painful to have to bank on such an unreliable ability. I am not a fan at all. This is one of the worst AoE abilities in the game. Just look at Brute Wreckers for an example of a fantastic and way better variant. So taking what we have so far, Idoneth really boiled down to some really interesting heroes and support options with a funky trait and reaction, but with nothing to back that up. They have 4 fighters as standard, and 3 of them are kind of bad, if not terrible. This makes Idoneth incredibly difficult to list build for and to play in general. Thankfully, we have some really good Bladeborn that helps elevate Idoneth slightly. Starting with Sireni's Razors, we have Sireni of the Abyss, and Sireni of the Abyss is outstanding. Movement 5, toughness 3 and 20 wounds makes her your most durable foot wizard so far. She has a range 2, 2-3, 2-3 melee attack, which isn't great, and a whopping range 3 to 7, 3-3, 3-7 range attack. I cannot overstate how strong that range attack is. She outclasses nearly every other wizard in the entire game, and for only 165 points, she's making the Slan Starmaster sweat. Give her +1 strength on her range attack and she will just start blowing things out of the water. Pun intended. She is a constant threat, and with clever use of Fade from Memory, she isn't going down easily. And remember, you can use Low Tide on turn 1 to move into range to fire early without having to burn all your actions to do so. All of that being said though, her stats are only half of why she's great, though she also has access to the unique ability Hammer Tide, which is a potentially game warping ability. It's a triple, and Hammer Tide reads: pick a corner of the battlefield and draw a straight line 1mm wide between the center of this fighter's base and that corner. Enemy fighters whose bases touch that line cannot jump, cannot fly, and they cannot climb until the end of this battle round. In addition, roll a number of dice equal to the value of this ability for each such fighter. Allocate 1 damage point to that fighter for each roll of a 3+. Firstly, the damage bit at the end is nice. You don't scoff at the chip damage, and in the right situation, you can hit a whole bunch of models with this. That being said though, the draw is the debuff, stopping fly, climb and jump on a standard Warcry board, which for the record, a standard Warcry board should be very terrain dense, is devastating. Having infinite range and Sireni being as fast as she is means you can nearly always pin whatever enemy you like to a corner. This is great on just about anything, but big bases in particular hate this because they can't easily move around the board normally, and then you remove their ability to climb and then they're completely boned. There is a very real chance they won't be able to move at all. If something is on a platform or any kind of elevation, they simply can't get down that turn. If Sireni is the thing that's on a platform, then your opponent can't climb up to attack her. The scenarios when Hammer Tide is useful are plentiful and common. Just remember that this does not stop your opponent from moving over low terrain. However, be aware that low terrain is anything below 1 inch. The moment a piece of terrain is 1 inch or more in height, they must climb. Be sure to check heights and inform your opponent at the start of the game so you don't land those gotcha moments. Overall, Sireni is amazing, both in Idoneth and out of Idoneth. She's a fantastic ally, a fantastic hero choice in faction. You cannot go wrong by taking Sireni as your hero choice. Next we have Sephania, and for 100 points you get a movement 5, toughness 4, 18 wound, range 1, 8-3-1-2 profile. This thing is great. It is one of the highest wounded things we have point for point. It's also one of the toughest and most damaging thanks to its fantastic attack value. Always remember you get +1 strength on turn 3 onwards, and High Tide exists. In an ideal scenario, Sephania can be as high as strength 5, and once you throw in the common blessing of +1 strength, you become strength 6, by turn 3, and at that point you are blending everything you touch with your 8 to 16 attacks. Stat wise, this guy is an absolute legend. I struggle not to take this thing in my list, but then we consider his ability and his reaction, and then suddenly Safania is even more amazing. Safania is just straight up packing. He has a quad called Crushing Wrap. A fighter can only use this ability before it will make a melee attack action. Roll 8 dice. For each roll of a 3+, add 1 to this fighter's strength characteristic for that attack action, and allocate 2 damage points to the target of that attack action. If the target is taken out of action, the melee attack action has no effect. The damage from Crushing Wrap is immense. If you want something dead, Safania will either crush it to death or so close to death that the following attacks will kill it or leave it maimed beyond belief. You are averaging something like 12 damage from this before you ever attack, and the strength boost after is incredible. This is better than Rampage in nearly every single situation. Finally, Safania has a unique reaction in their kit called Inkjet. A fighter can make this reaction after they are targeted by a melee attack action but before the hit rolls are made. For each hit roll from that attack action that misses, after the attack action is resolved, you can move this fighter up to 2 inches. In addition, if all the hits rolled are missed, that enemy fighter cannot make attack actions until the end of the battle round. Key things to note here is that the move you do with Inkjet is not a move action, therefore you can move out of combat. Because you aren't using a move action, you can also move if you are netted. Heck, you can even move out of combat with one thing and into combat with something else. The removal of action from the wording makes this a disgustingly versatile move. The added effect of preventing future attacks on a full whiff is also nice, even though it won't happen all that often. You use Inkjet to get out of sticky situations or just to catapult yourself across the board and onto objectives or something when your opponent least expect it. The more attacks they have, the better for this. Remember, when you disengage, you only move 3 inches, so Inkjet could very well move you further than a disengage, open it with the board, and plays in all kinds of fun ways. Overall, Inkjet is a really fun reaction that gives Safania even more play, which frankly is incredibly impressive. Finally, we have Alethea and Renglaith, and sadly these two are often the ignored lads from this Bladeborn warband, and honestly rightfully so to some degree. That being said, I actually do like them as a gimmick, and I have used them a lot in my Idoneth games, and I will continue to meme and gimmick out with them. They are both 95 points with movement 5, toughness 4 and 10 wounds, making them more expensive than Thralls, but also noticeably harder to kill thanks to +2 wounds and +1 toughness on their profile. Not only that, they are better offensively too. Alethea has range 2 3-4-1-4 and a range 1 4-4-1-4, making him great at multiple ranges, especially at 1 inch. Renglaith on the other hand has range 2 3-4-1-4 and a range 3 2-4-2-4, again making him really solid at any range. Range 3 is always nice to see. The stat bumps and interesting offensive profiles are one thing, but where they really shine in my opinion is their ability, Hurl Lanmari Blade. Add the value of this ability to the range characteristic of the next melee attack action made by this fighter this activation. After that attack action, this fighter cannot make melee attack actions for the rest of this activation. So, there's a lot to dissect here. Firstly, despite being a melee attack, if the range of your attack goes above 3, it is no longer a melee attack, it's a missile attack with a minimum range of 0. This is very important to note. This means you can't be countered. In fact, most reactions just don't work, and you can fire into combat in certain situations, and all of that is really cool. It also means you won't gain the strength bonus from Power of the Tides or High Tide if your range exceeds 3. If you are range 3 though, you are good to go. All of that out of the way, this is pretty good early on. You are movement 6 thanks to Power of the Tides, so you move and spend a double to throw your sword. Next turn you do it again. Turn 3 onwards you can keep on throwing your sword, or you can move into combat and make use of your strength bonuses and your attack bonuses from Power of the Tides and High Tide. Why this ability is so fun, gimmicky and frankly good is that it works with blessings in all kinds of fun ways. Because both stat lines are actually melee stat lines, you can absolutely buff them with blessings in ways you can't do with actual range attacks. even if you will be using them as range attacks later on in the game. Let's not beat around the bush. Alethea having a 4-4-1-4 range attack on a movement 6 body with up to 7 inches of range is really nice. Renglith having up to 9 inches of range on a 2-4-2-4 profile is also pretty nice too, but then you get weird and you go all out. You give Alethea +1 damage, so his blade is a 4-4-2-4. You give Renglith +1 damage or +1 attack for a 2-4-3-4 or a 3-4-2-4, and now you have 2 really fun, super mobile potential range units that are ideal for cutting through chaff and dealing decent chunks of damage to everything else. Sure, with those blessings, they are 120 points each, which is comically high, but man, is it a fun combo that has done work in so many games. Even if it is gimmicky, it is ridiculous, but it's absolutely worth doing if you want a little bit of fun in your lists. Nobody expects the 120 point blessed wound 10 hurled blade. On to our final set of blokes, and these guys are Elethane's Soul Raid, and we will kick off with Elethane the Ill-Fated himself. For 165 points, Elethane is why you don't take a Soul Render. Movement 5, Toughness 3 and 24 wounds, with a range 1 4-4-2-4 and a range 3 3-4-2-4. This is just a great profile for the cost. It is absolutely banging. Elethane can take a hit thanks to his pretty high wound total, and he can dish it back with his more than adequate melee profiles. Not only that, Elethane comes with Soul Net to boot, giving him a net identical to Hangman's Knot, and overall Elethane joins Cyrene as an outstanding hero choice in Idoneth and as an ally. First of Elethane's fighters is Doingclaw, and I love Doingclaw to bits. For 110 points, he might be a little bit expensive, but honestly, movement 4, toughness 6, wounds 12, range 1, 2-5-2-5 is just a fun profile to have. I like to slap on +4 wounds all the time to get him to wound 16, because wound 16 and toughness 6 is just nice and tanky, and movement 4 isn't all that bad since we have access to Power of the Tides to make a movement 5 and Low Tide. Sadly, the low volume of attacks is just something you have to deal with up until you get to High Tide or you start using Onslaughts, but his attack profile isn't really why you take him, even though he is base strength 5, which is pretty funky. Counter will be your main source of damage because you have toughness 6, so things with lots of attacks will just kill themselves on you. Doingclaw is by far the most durable elf in Idoneth. It's just a shame that the most durable elf in Idoneth is actually a very small crab. Furin is a model that I really like, but I rarely take because I am far too busy memeing with Alethea and Renglith. For 120 points for movement 5, toughness 4 and 16 wounds with a range 1 4-3-2-4 is a perfectly fine profile. The strength is a little bit low, so you'll probably want to bless that to bring her to 135 points, but she's durable, she's fast, and she hits pretty hard into chaff, especially from turn 3 onwards. You can certainly do worse, but like with a lot of this awkwardly pointed non-hero stuff, you can struggle to include them, but she's not a bad pick at all. Tamiel is up next, and Tamiel is great. 90 points is nice and cheap, movement 5, toughness 3 and 10 wounds with range 8, no minimum, 2-4-1-4 range, makes Tamiel another really solid range profile and plays nicely into how I like to play Idoneth. Throw in his pull with his triple Riptide Harpoon and you have a great support piece that works really well with Elethane. These two combined give you a net and a pull, and now you can mess with your opponent in all kinds of fun ways. Throw in Cyrene for a bit of fun, and now no one gets to move and no one has fun but you. Do bear in mind that Tamiel's pull is slightly weaker than other pulls. You cannot pull things out of combat if they are engaged. This is unique to both Tamiel and Apotrax in Tzeentch Demons. Do not forget that restriction because it is quite substantial. On the flip side though, you can just use Riptide Harpoon to get an extra attack action off, which can be good. This helps Tamiel run around and plink chip and pull from weird angles. A final thing to note, you don't have to land any hits with that range attack to trigger the pull. The pull will always trigger. The range attack is just a nice little bonus. Finally, we have Spinefin, and I might be in the minority here, but I absolutely love Spinefin. 80 points for movement 12 with fly, toughness 2, wound 6, range 1, 3-3-1-3 is a mixture of good and bad. Firstly, it's made of paper. If anything looks at it, Spinefin probably dies. That being said, having access to a cheap Movement 12 flying unit opens up all kinds of tricky plays. Suddenly you can snipe objectives from the other side of the board, you can mess with treasure carriers, you can try to land those last couple of wounds in a last ditch effort to kill things. You can even use Spinefin as a mobile source to trigger Fade from Memory, making it a surprisingly good defensive piece. Considering Spinefin is as expensive as a Namati Thrall, I would much rather lose out on all those melee stats, all those defenses, just for the utility of movement that this thing brings. And don't forget that Spinefin can also use Low Tide for even more movement and gets buffed by Power of the Tides, bringing this thing to a whopping movement 13 on turn 1 and turn 2, making it one of, if not the fastest unit in the entire game. And that's everyone and everything covered, and I am always torn on Idoneth. I have so much fun running Idoneth with all in-faction lists that play in very specific ways, but despite that, I can't sit here and say they are great. I can't even sit here and say they are good. They really struggle competitively, and their lineup is largely bad if you ignore their Bladeborn. Bar like 2 heroes and like 1 fighter, which are legitimately good, the rest are either kind of mid or straight up terrible. Their Bladeborn does a lot of the heavy lifting if you add them in, because they are all at least good, even Alethea and Renglaith. If you are going to play Idoneth, you have to accept that you're going to lose a lot of games, but you're probably going to have a lot of fun messing around with their wacky abilities, reactions and trait as you spiral down the whirlpool of death and defeat. Now, if you want to meme and gimmick out as much as I do, and I love to meme and gimmick out, you can run something like this. Elethane the Ill-Fated with +1 crit, Sirene of the Abyss with +1 strength on her range attack, Doingclaw with +4 wounds, Sephania with +1 crit, Renglaith with +1 attack, Alethea with +1 damage, Tamiel, and Spinefin. This list is comically high on blessings, literally 100 points worth of blessings, with half of those on Alethea and Renglaith. But unironically, this list is a lot of fun to play, and it's not as terrible as it looks. Ideal scenario, you will run around early, staying away and shooting with Sirene, Tamiel, Renglaith, Alethea to soften things up. Throughout Hammertide, your net, your pull to disrupt, you have lots of options early on with how you want to interact with your opponent, but ideally, you aren't getting into combat immediately. Turn 2, you are doing more of the same. Try to land a kill or 2 with your firepower, then at the end of the turn, you start to engage with your beaters, things like Sephania, Elethane, Doingclaw, maybe Renglaith, and maybe Alethea, so when turn 3 comes around, you are in combat and you can make use of your enhanced strength. Ideally, you will want to pop High Tide with Elethane to get that perma buff for +1 strength and +1 attack, and now you just blend. Elethane is now a 5-6-2-5, Doingclaw is a 3-7-2-5 or a 4-7-2-5 if you onslaught. Sephania is popping off with 8-5-1-3, Alethea is a 5-6-2-4, etc, etc. You have the quantity and the quality to punch through a lot of things, provided you don't die first and you pick your targets carefully, and importantly, you make sure you don't spread out too thin. This can be quite difficult to pull off on objective missions where the objectives are very spread out, but if they are close together, then this works really, really well. A key thing to note though, you never really want to fight Titans, you just net them, you Hammer Tide, you maybe go for the kill if you have access to a Crushing Wrap and get a little bit tricky with that, but in short, you just Hammer Tide net and move away, and you blend everything else. Once all is said and done, your gimmicky list is alive and you have hopefully won the game by a narrow margin, or it all fell apart on turn 1 and you lost very early. That is the nature of the gimmicky Idoneth beast. If you want something a little bit more serious, then consider something like Nikelian, Ishlian Guard, Lockian Prince, Sirene of the Abyss, Doingclaw, Sephania, Alethea, Renglith, Tamiel, and Spinefin. This list has that extra added speed and durability of the Ishlian Guard Prince. You'll ideally give Duinclaw +4 wounds or Sireni of the Abyss +1 strength. You can optionally drop Alethea and Renglith and take 2 Namati Thralls, at which point that'll save you another 30 points to then bless more freely elsewhere. As with before, you largely don't want to engage in combat. You want to kind of stay safe, stay back, and just play the objective, play the mission, and use your Ishlian Guard, Lochlean Prince to get into combat with their turn 2 deployments, murderize their chaff, get stuck in there and really act as a big old distraction who won't die easily. That Biovoltaic barrier is incredibly good. It is expensive to use though, it'll take up all your triples to do this. But this guy will eventually blend through everything. His attack profile is great. It only gets better as time goes on, especially once High Tide triggers. This guy only gets better at killing things as the game goes on. And like I said, he will never die. He is such a fun piece to play around with. And this list is probably inarguably better than the gimmicky list. I find them both very fun. Like always, take one of these lists, mess around with them and just have fun. Experiment by taking things out and throwing extra things in. Try out the Achillean King for some pure blend. Throw in the Morsar Guard, right? Throw in the big old AoE Boomba and just see how that works for you. This is just a jumping off point for you to make your own lists. These are just 2 that I like to run right now. And that is the end of this video. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Please drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to help keep the channel going and fight that dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. And until next time, lads, ladies, and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra. Groovy. Welcome to the post-toast credits. A massive shout out to all of my patrons and members, but an extra big shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers: Andy Morris, Blah Blah Blah, Brioche, the Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Lord Fireaxe, Maps, Sable Saver, Steve Bean, the Houston Toad, and Velas. Thank you all for continuing to support this shit show of a channel, and I'll catch you all next time.